Maybe we'll start. Um, Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and helping the Summit Historical Society celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Summit Public Library. This isn't the first time our volunteers have joined forces with the library on a project, and it's always a pleasure to work with them. And special greetings to those of you who are viewing today's event via Zoom. Today's talk features a neighborhood just a stone's throw away. It is my updated adaptation of a 1986 slide program called A Stroll from Oak Knoll, which was created as a preview for a spring walking tour led by Sandy Brown. And if you were ever lucky enough to attend a Sandy talk or take one of her historic preservation courses, you were lucky indeed. Her knowledge of Summit's architecture and streetscapes was second to none. This is the original title slide from that 1986 event, held in a year that Historical Society volunteers were working feverishly to save Summit's oldest remaining structure, the Carter House, from demolition. There were slideshows and walking tours, porch luncheons, and fashion show teas. The building was saved, and today it stands at 90 Butler Parkway after being relocated from River Road. It is our and your local history museum, and we hope you'll visit. Our archives feature things like maps, photos, family histories, Summit High School yearbooks, city directories, postcards, paintings, and furniture, and we'd love to give you a tour and have you spend some time looking through our files. In the meantime, in the early 1700s, much of Summit looked like this, which happens to be a glen between Mount Vernon and New Providence Avenues, near where the transfer station and recycling center are now. Our town was basically a wooded, undeveloped portion of Elizabethtown with a family farm scattered here and there. The second drawing of land allotments held by the Elizabethtown Associators was held between 1736 and 1738, and Daniel Potter drew a square-mile lot that included where you sit here today and encompassed much of present-day downtown. For nearly 100 years, that holding remained within the Potter family until 1836, when Jothan Potter, one of Daniel's great-grandsons, sold 200 acres of his farm to Jonathan Crane Bunnell, who owned a sawmill on the Passaic River near where today's Stanley Road is. When you visit the Carter House, be sure to see the oil painting we have of Mr. Bunnell, along with his desk, which was purchased at auction in the 1980s by the Historical Society. With the advent of train transportation in New Jersey, the Morris and Essex Railroad had proposed a route to Chatham. Sorry, this is Mr. Bunnell's sawmill. The route to Chatham would have paralleled today's Morris Turnpike and taken advantage of the gap in the short hills. But this would have bypassed Mr. Bunnell's mill, all of the land he had purchased from the Potters, and many other businesses that could have made use of access to the tracks. So Mr. Bunnell, known as Crane, offered M&E executives a deal too good to refuse, a free right-of-way if they'd lay their tracks up and over what was called the summit of the short hills and then down towards his mill. It lengthened the route and it involved climbing a mountain, but the railroad was not about to turn down free land. By 1837, the area had not only rail service, but also a new name, Summit. Historians have said the Summit, as the town was first formally known, was shortened so that it could fit more easily in printed railroad timetables. The next sizable land purchase was shortly after 1837, when John Blackburn bought 120 acres from Amos Potter and built a home where the western end of the Grand Summit Hotel nearest Blackburn Road is. The only known photo here shows the addition of a hotel, the Blackburn House, which was constructed after Mr. Blackburn's 1846 death. If we circle back to the corner of Morris Avenue and Prospect Street, in the 1800s, we would have encountered the house of Crane Bunnell's son, also named Jonathan. Today, that property is the site of the Connection, which recently marked its own 100th anniversary. Jonathan Bonnell's job was to run the Summit Home Land Company, the holding entity that managed properties owned by his father. Depending on the year of the map you're looking at, you might think the firm owned much of the land that comprises the center of today's city, and that's because it did. Jonathan put the land in his own home's backyard to use when he built houses on the left side of Prospect by 1882, a number of which still stand. Then came the Summit Cricket Grounds and Clubhouse at the bend of the street, and they remained until 1900. Number 46 Prospect here was resided in by the Littell family, whose members were descendants of Crane Bonnell through the marriage of his daughter Mehitabel to William Littell. Not only do we have a framed sampler at the Carter House that was stitched by a young Mehitabel, many of the items in our costume collection come from the attic of 46 Prospect. We have dresses, parasols, and shoes, plus military uniforms, children's clothing, and even a top hat or two. In the 1980s, before the adaptation of the Carter House to a museum, the society was headquartered in a former classroom at Wilson School, where volunteers did a great job of dressing mannequins and displaying gowns and other apparel from varied areas. This outfit was donated from the Littell estate and is a two-piece white cotton dress with lace inserts and a pink ribbon at the waist. On the opposite side of Prospect, George Manley, a native Philadelphian and New York Stock Exchange member, had retained a strip of land that led to his family's second home in Summit, which they called Fair Oaks as one word. Their first home in town, Ellerslie, was where the Rosary Shrine is located, and Mr. Manley said at the time he'd chosen that site because it provided his favorite sunset views in town. Mr. Manley arrived in town in 1858 and decided country living suited him. Fair Oaks, his second home here, faced Locust Avenue, where there's now a garden apartment complex. Mr. Manley was married to Mary Ann Matthews in 1840, and they had 7 children. Mr. Manley's gifts to his adopted hometown included the land where our first library, now the Summit Playhouse, stands. Upon Mr. Manley's death, a sanatorium, also called Fair Oaks, but as 2 words, opened in the home, founded by Doctors Elliott Gordon and Thomas Prout, colleagues at the State Hospital in Morris Plains, known as Greystone. In 1904, a new building went up on the Fair Oaks campus, this one facing Prospect Street, and that marked the beginning of the present Summit Oaks complex. The last old building on the Behavioral Health Hospital campus was raised just a few years ago. Another home we'll look at is 33 Prospect, where Mary Elizabeth Chamberlain, who may have been a widow, relocated from New York in about 1878 with her 3 sons. 3 subsequent generations of her family remained in town. Mrs. Chamberlain was born in 1818 in a house on Warren Street in New York City. In Summit, she was a member of Calvary Episcopal Church, and she was also one of the founders of Jersey City's Christ Hospital. It was noted in her 1902 obituary that her labor and devotion in church and charitable work were unceasing and ended only with her life. And proving that most modern-day obituary writers cannot hold a candle to their predecessors, staff at the Summit Herald in 1902 wrote, "Born at the beginning of the last century, her descriptions of the early days of our great metropolis were most picturesque and vivid. Although a New Yorker by birth, Mrs. Chamberlain came from an old New England family, several of her ancestors having served with distinction during the War of the Revolution in the Connecticut troop. In spite of age and illness, she kept in touch with all the activities of the time, and her death removes a bright link from the chain which connects a present and a past generation." One of her sons, George W., never married. He was described in his 1931 obituary as being among the oldest commuters on the DL&W Railroad. After a 20-year career at the Home Fire Insurance Company, he took a position as a member of the Board of Brokers, where his specialty became old and inactive securities. Then, according to the author of his obituary, Mr. Chamberlain, quote, felt the necessity of rest and recreation, so he gave up his business and took a long vacation, making a sailing trip to South America. Still part of the obituary. A rather curious circumstance is that he was preparing to make a trip when he was called suddenly to take one to that bourne from which no traveler returns. Mr. Chamberlain's death takes another from that thin gray line which grows smaller every year and leaves a sad gap where his mingled laugh and talk will be heard no more. One of his brothers, John Frederick, who went by Frederick, became a banker and member of the New York Stock Exchange. From 1896 to 1902, he served as president of the Summit Board of Education, and he was a director of the Summit Bank and of the Summit Building and Loan Association. In about 1881, Frederick Chamberlain built 41 Prospect, and his daughter Edna recalled a grape arbor between her family's home and that of her grandmother next door. Mr. Chamberlain and his family moved to 96 Hobart Avenue in 1900, which you can see in the background of this slide. The family was known for owning the second car in Summit, a one-cylinder Cadillac. Later, the Chamberlains had a Pierce Arrow. Based in Buffalo, Pierce Arrow cars were manufactured from 1901 to 1938, though the year of this photo is unknown. Frederick Chamberlain built houses for his three daughters. May Berries was diagonally across Hobart on the corner. Jessie Moore was at 97 Hobart, and Edna, who lived from 1878 to 1959, resided around the corner at 29 Whitridge. I don't know where, this almost to me looks like the Kent Court Apartments, but I don't think they were old enough. Obviously, that's not her home on Whitridge, though. Miss Chamberlain was one of the founders of both the Summit Playhouse Association, where she performed in plays, and the Summit Art Association, which is now the Visual Arts Center of New Jersey. Her 1959 obituary described her as actively identified for many years with numerous community and welfare organizations in Summit. A communicant at Calvary Church, she was also one of the original members of the Summit chapter of the American Red Cross, for which she chaired the surgical dressings effort in both World Wars, and she was the author of a chapter history. Back to Prospect Street, Jersey City native William Lyle first rented 41, which no longer stands, then purchased it. Mr. Lyle made his living in the textile industry as a manufacturer of looms and other machinery, and his father was a native of Scotland. The younger Mr. Lyle, born in 1840, was active in the St. Andrews Society, where his term as president followed that of Scotsman Andrew Carnegie. It was at least in part due to their friendship, it is believed, that funds were donated by Mr. Carnegie to build Summit's second library at this current site. Summit's Carnegie Library, opened in 1911, was demolished in the 1960s, but many libraries funded by the philanthropist and industrialists survive, including quite a few in New Jersey. That was Summit's. It was here. It faced Maple. Mr. Lyle's son, Earl Harvey Lyle, was an architect who graduated from Amherst, studied architecture at Columbia, and attended l'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris before he designed his hometown Carnegie Library and also his father's home at 92 Prospect, where they moved in 1911. The house was notable for features including a beamed and bracketed dining room ceiling copied from a Dutch painting and light fixtures etched with a tulip design. In 1916, while heading home from Manhattan, the architect's father, William Lyle, suffered an apparent heart attack in the 19th Street station of the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad. At the time, he was the president of Brighton Mills, which had been established in Paterson. Among the Lyles' neighbors was William Zebedee Larnard, a lawyer in New York who specialized in real estate and mortgages. After the gold panic of 1869, the story was that Mr. Larnard had to be escorted to the ferry home by a police guard. He was being chased by a mob who mistook him for Jay Gould. The September crash had occurred due to an attempt by financier Mr. Gould and railway magnate James Fisk to corner the gold market and drive up the price. Soon after Mr. Larnard's 1872 marriage to Catherine Penniman, he built the 18-room Stoneover on Blackburn Road, formerly the convent on the campus of Oak Knoll School of the Holy Child. But Mr. Larnard was also the one who constructed the Blackburn House, a summer resort added to what was originally John Blackburn's home. In 1928, it was replaced by the Suburban Hotel, and today it's called the Grand Summit Hotel and is undergoing major renovations under its newest owners. Mr. Larnard also constructed some buildings in the central retail business district, including the 3-story 11 Beechwood Road, home to the city's first bank, of which Mr. Larnard was a founder and first president, a post he held from 1891 to 1896. He then formed First National Bank, which occupied 11 Beechwood until 1909. Also built by Mr. Larnard was 446 Springfield Avenue across from Woodland. Among the tenants was a business called Mrs. Rappelier's Notions Shop, where the Library Association shelved its books in a back room before it had a dedicated library facility. In addition to civic and charitable participation, including 9 years as Library Association president, Mr. Larnard gave Summit 4 acres along Tulip Street for construction of an elementary school named in memory of his son Brayton, who as a young teenager died as a result of what was described as a gym accident. The school opened in September 1912 with 267 pupils in its 10 classrooms, and the principal was Miss Helen Cassidy. Mr. Larnard is also credited with building the home at 3 Tulip Street in 1889 to house Martin Baylor's Summit Collegiate Institute. When Professor Baylor returned to Orange in 1894, one of his teachers, Clara Potwin, opened her co-ed Miss Potwin's school there. Miss Potwin's father had been a Chinese tutor at Yale, and in Summit, his daughter's students included the Soong sisters. Mei Ling Soong later married Chiang Kai-shek, former president of the Republic of China, and her sister Qing Ling wed Sun Yat-sen, who also served as president. In 1928, 3 Tulip was raised. Upon her death, Miss Potwin had bequeathed the library $4,300. Returning to Mr. Larnard's residential development, he also built 25 Tulip, a 2.5-story home that combines Queen Anne and shingle style. The porch has what are called flattened arches and features Tuscan columns, a popular architectural trend locally at the time. Across the street in about 1910, 26 Tulip was designed by and the home of Bernard Jamay, who also designed St. Teresa's Church on Morris Avenue. This colonial revival house has 2.5 stories, and its architectural details included a fan light above the front door. A dry-laid fieldstone retaining wall along the street is all that remains. Sorry, I skipped. When this house was on the market in 1978, it was mentioned in the listing that not included in the sale were a brass bell on the front door and 2 backyard azaleas. Now, there are places where you can drive now on Prospect, Tulip, and Locust, and the old dry-laid fieldstone retaining wall that you see is the original wall from Mr. Manley's family's Fair Oaks home. Now, here's a bit of history you've driven by countless times and probably never noticed. In 1908, at 64 Prospect, the Vodi family took ownership of their new home, where a gate post still shows Inwood, the name given to the house, carefully carved in stone. Edwin Scott Vodi in 1877 had begun retail and wholesale organ sales in Western New York State. By 1883, he organized the Whitney Organ Company in Detroit, and in 1890, he spent 6 months studying pipe organs in Europe. Mr. Vodi's company built the first electronically operated organ, which made its debut at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. In 1896, Mr. Vodi, who would soon commence construction on his house, invented the pianola, commonly called the player piano. The Vodi Organ Company was founded to build aeolian pipe organs and pianolas at a factory in Garwood, and we have one on view at the Carter House. One part of the home's driveway branched and became a driveway leading to a 4-car garage that is now a separate private home on Oakland Place. And during its time as a garage, the structure looked like this. 4 vehicles could fit because they were parked in tandem, 2 on either side of a depression in the center of the floor. The Vodi garage also boasted a billiards room and an apartment resided in by Alexander Keyes, who drove for the family for 30 years. The Vodis held the distinction of being Summit's first car owners with their purchase of a Stanley steamer, one of many vehicles to call the garage home over the years. The grounds that surrounded 64 Prospect and its garage were once extensively landscaped, extended to Tulip Street, and featured a bridge over the Larned Brook, which residents also sometimes called the Brayton Brook. While Mr. Vodi made himself a name in the music world, he was also active locally. He served as Common Council president in 1904 and 1905. He spent his leisure time at Canoe Country Club, and he was a director of Summit's First National Bank. Back to Tulip Street, William Lyle's daughter Kitty at number 33 gained her own reputation as a community volunteer. She was described as never failing to demonstrate enthusiasm, always being willing to work hard, and possessing a great concern for the welfare of others. Miss Lyle married Oliver B. Merrill, a minister's son and Amherst graduate who dedicated his career to advertising and publishing. From 1915 to 1917, he was president of the Magazine Club of New York. Closer to home, Mr. Merrill was a trustee of Overlook Hospital, a Summit councilman for 10 years, and was elected mayor for a term that began in 1920. He served on the planning board and the World War Ration Board, helping to raise money for Liberty loans. The Merrills were active at Central Presbyterian. Oliver and Kitty Merrill still owned 33 Tulip when he died in 1951, and she converted it to 2-family. It remained such until 1983. When Mr. Merrill had died, it was written that he'd never been known to utter an unkind word. Around the corner from the Merrills at 66 Prospect, a prairie-style home of stucco with a green tile roof was constructed in about 1908, designed by architect B.G. Sims. Decorative Tuscan columns were placed next to simple corner posts. The initial owner appears to have been a Montclair widow named Kate A. Bennett, who spent summers in Summit with her children. The late Mr. Bennett, vice president and general manager of the Singer Sewing Machine Company, had died of pneumonia at 45 on a business trip to Berlin. His father was Singer's treasurer. Thomas and Emma Smith and their family relocated from Hobart Avenue to 66 Prospect in 1926. He was president of Standard Brands and liked to joke that even though the 18-room house had been built 18 years prior, it had only been occupied for half the year, so he considered it only 9 years old. Mr. Smith served on both Summit's planning and zoning boards. Emma Smith taught Sunday school at Central Presbyterian and was president of the Town Improvement Association, which initiated Summit's first townwide mosquito control, townwide garbage collection, and the creation of public playgrounds in town. She drove for the Red Cross Motor Corps, was appointed Special Officer number 8 on the city's police department, and was an honorary member of the fire department appointed by Mayor George W. Cornish in recognition of her civic accomplishments. On the opposite side of Larned stands 72 Prospect, identified by some as a McKim Mead and White design because it is attributed to Charles Ailing Gifford, who had begun his career at that firm before striking out on his own. He also drew the plans for 93 Prospect, which we'll get to shortly. Newark native Mr. Gifford was educated at Stevens Institute in Hoboken. The owner of 76 Prospect was Mrs. Frederick Watermeyer, Margaret, and while details about her have proven difficult to find, it is noted in the Historical Society archives that she was godmother to the son of her next-door neighbors, a boy named George H. Paulson. Completed in 1896 or 1897, number 77 Prospect was for many years home to the Briggs family. Walter Dean Briggs made his living in the woolen textile industry, but his passion was horses. Mr. Briggs was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1854, first moved to Summit in 1894 after spending some summers at the Blackburn House, and lived until 1915. Mrs. Briggs, the former Clara Manton Knight of Providence, was born in about 1880 and died at age 85 in 1971. Mr. and Mrs. Briggs are buried in their home state at Juniper Hill Cemetery in Bristol. And one of the advantages that I had in updating this talk, which was first done in 1986, is that because it was done pre-internet, we now have things like the New York Times obituaries archive, which we can get to instantly that they didn't have then. Daughter Helen Briggs is pictured in the dress she wore for her 1905 graduation from Kent Place. The two Briggs daughters recalled years later how they dreaded the hours spent on fittings when a dressmaker came out from New York to their house for 2 to 3 weeks at a stretch. Another regular visitor to 77 Prospect was likely the wagon from John Vauquelin's Vienna Bakery. Mr. Vauquelin was born in Germany and came to Summit in 1890. 2 years later, he had established his home and business at 83 Summit Avenue, but 5 years later died of cancer at age 44. Employee Emil Fitterer bought the building, and while son John Vauquelin Jr. drove the bakery wagon, he never ran the business. Instead, John Jr. began a banking career at Summit Trust, and in the 1940s, he was employed by Hill City Savings and Loan. In 1910, he wed fellow Summit resident Laura Batchelor, whose mother was the former Anne Eliza Dean, presumably of the large family for whom East Summit was once known as Deantown. When those bakery wagons and other vehicles had reason to visit the Briggs home, it is likely their drivers admired the accommodations for the horses in residence. In the stable and carriage house, every possible step was taken to keep Mr. Briggs's animals well-groomed and content. There was even an overhead spray set up so horses could get showered on hot days. Heavy drapes were lowered in front of the stalls on cold days, and each enclosure had a name tag identifying its occupant. Family members recalled horses named with affection and humor, such as Snakes, who had a weaving gait. When a coachman was said to command, "Go to school," it was said that Snakes set out for the Kent Place campus. Pictured is what was called a light trap, with the horses in tandem and a coachman back to back with Mr. Briggs. The coach house at the Briggs home usually accommodated 7 horses at a time. 2 matched pairs named Fit and Flirt and Sport and Tinkerbell pulled this coach. And the Briggs daughters also recalled a majestic beast called Duke and a polo pony named Zip. A longtime Briggs family coachman was Robert T. Coyle, grandfather of Summit Historical Society trustee emeritus Sheila Grasso Deutsch. Though their names have been lost to history, this pair pulled a piece of equipment called a runabout. His purchases of fine horses and carriages were a true reflection of Mr. Briggs's love of coaching. But that love was not shared by all family members. This was a Briggs carriage and 4, and if you look closely, daughter Helen's expression certainly seems apprehensive. And as an adult, she admitted she had never learned to love the sport. On Saturdays, after the stable and coach house were cleaned, the horses groomed and all of the equipment polished, the carriages were backed into place and white sand was spread to neat borders, after which the coachman used colored sand to create designs and medallion features. Mr. Briggs also loved his extensive gardens. Housed in the coach house were gardeners, coachmen, footmen, stablemen, and other members of the household staff. Meanwhile, automobiles were becoming more prevalent and local roads were being paved to accommodate them. During a 1913 trip to Maplewood, all 4 horses pulling one of the Briggs coaches went down on a paved hill, and Mr. Briggs realized his beloved hobby was no longer practical or safe. The horses and the carriages went to owners living west of Summit, where most roads remained unpaved, and those who knew him said Mr. Briggs had tears in his eyes when the last animal left Summit. Over the years, the coach house has become a separate residence at 30 Blackburn Road, and its longtime residents were once Commander Edwin J. and Margaret Quinby, accomplished musicians. The commander, a New York City native and retired Navy officer who served during both World Wars, also listed engineer, inventor, author, and entrepreneur on his resume. The Quinbys converted the former carriage room into a music studio that contained the console of a theater organ, a harp, a harpsichord, a rebuilt 100-year-old Steinway piano, and a Chickering concert grand piano built as a wedding gift for the daughter of department store owner John Wanamaker, but never uncrated until it came to Summit. Still, the Quinbys had no problem hosting as many as 70 guests for events. The equine wash area became a large indoor reflecting pool surrounded by plants. The former tack room and harness and grain storage areas hosted the organ's 1,000 pipes, while the mechanism that powered the instrument was in the basement. The hayloft became the main bedroom, often described by Commander Quinby as the perfect spot for hitting the hay. He had begun his career as a merchant marine wireless operator and was later employed in research and development at RCA Laboratories. The commander was credited with multiple inventions in wireless and electronics communications, and at one time he was vice president of Shepherd Laboratories in Summit at 480 Morris Avenue. Most recently, the occupant of 480 Morris Avenue was Lindabury McCormick, a law firm, and it's between Gates Avenue and Webster Avenue on that side of the street. But Commander Quinby's most noteworthy achievement, if he were asked, was likely the rescue of the stern wheel steamboat Delta Queen from the scrapyard. In the late 1950s, he learned the storied vessel was to be sold for parts and worked to save it, later helping oversee its relocation from California's Sacramento River to the Mississippi. Commander Quinby subsequently served as chairman of the board of the Green Line, the river steamship company that first operated the Delta Queen in cruise service on the Mississippi. Unfortunately, most recently, it looks like the Delta Queen is no longer in service. Every once in a while, there seems to be a fundraising effort to get it back in service, but it doesn't seem to have happened yet. Using his love of music and his engineering skills, Commander Quinby reconstructed an old steam calliope at Shepherd Labs in Summit so the keyboard could sit on one deck and the steam pipes on another. He noted he'd played such instruments before, and he knew the issue of being burned when the pipes emitted steam. At the time, the commander explained the importance of calliopes as they announced the impending arrival of a vessel on the river from as far as 5 miles away. When he described testing the instrument in Summit before its installation on the Delta Queen, he said a trial run resulted in, quote, "First the children, then the parents, and close upon their heels, the cops." And then apparently he also used to ride on or sail on the Delta Queen at times and entertain the passengers by playing the organ. Next door to the Quinbys at 24 Blackburn stands a home built by her parents as a wedding gift. Oh, sorry, this one should have been the last one. So here he is on the Delta Queen. This is the newspaper photo that we reproduced. Next door to the Quinbys at 24 Blackburn stands a home built by her parents as a wedding gift for Helen Louise Briggs when she married Norman Lee Swartout. If you remember, Helen was the daughter who admitted never having taken to carriage riding. Called the paddock because it was constructed behind the stable, the Swordouts often referred to the home as their dream house. Born in 1879 in Auburn, New York, the Briggs' son-in-law Norman lived in Summit until 1930, when he died at age 51. He and Helen Briggs had married in 1911, 6 years after her graduation from Kent Place. When the Summit Playhouse was founded in 1918, Mr. Swartout was its first director and a charter member. Mrs. Swartout died in 1971. By then, she had relocated to Franklin Place, and she is buried in Chatham's Fairmount Cemetery. Augustus and Harriet Robbins Libby first traveled to the Hill City in 1875 for a summer stay at the Blackburn House. Mrs. Libby's brother, C.A. Robbins, lived in town. Soon, the Libbys built the first house on New England Avenue, and in 1886, Mr. Libby convinced some of his neighbors to invest in a generating plant as a private source of electricity for their homes. In 1892, the Libbys relocated to the first home on Beekman Terrace, called Finisterre, after a peninsula in Galicia, Spain. Along the ridge between Beekman Road and Springfield Avenue, Mr. Libby developed a 9-hole golf course. It was said you could easily identify him from a good distance away, as his standard course attire was a red jacket with a green collar. The Libby family's third and final home in Summit was at 80 Prospect at the southwest corner of Blackburn. One of Mr. Libby's interests was the Summit Library, and when George Manley donated money for a dedicated building to be constructed, it was with the understanding community members would raise the money for its construction. Mr. Libby, it was said, began carrying around a small notebook in which he tracked donations, including pledges from fellow commuters at the train station as they waited to begin their daily commutes. So there's the original library, which is now the Summit Playhouse, and that's Mr. Manley's Fair Oaks in its backyard. So this building, now the Summit Playhouse, was home to the library until the Carnegie Library was constructed in 1911. And Mr. Libby was a Library Association trustee from 1878 to 1911 and had also served on the school board. Upon Mr. Libby's death, his obituary noted, "This passes one of Summit's most useful, esteemed, and delightful citizens." Daughter Marie Curtis Libby was also active in community fairs. Having studied at the Pratt Institute Library School, she served on the board of the library in Summit for 25 years. In 1966, Miss Libby had mentioned in an interview with a Summit Herald reporter that she had founded the reading club at the library when it was on Tulip Street, and that she created a local organization called the Women's Institute. But those accomplishments were disputed after retired librarian Louise R. Morris read the article and wrote a 48-page rebuttal, noting the qualities of truth and accuracy are of first importance above any considerations of personal friendship or of social or financial status. One can only imagine what it must have been like when the two women next crossed paths, possibly the following Sunday before services at Central Presbyterian Church, where the Libbys were longtime attendees and supported many church projects and outreach efforts. Living across from the Libbys at 85 Prospect were Bertram Elias and Susan Underwood. Their home was built in 1906 with a stucco interior. Architect William Balch combined Italian Renaissance with Prairie style. With his brother Elmer, Bert, as he was known, founded a firm called Underwood and Underwood. In 1897, the Underwoods began to provide pictures with news interest to periodicals, and at one time, the firm was the largest publisher of stereo views in the world, producing more than 10 million of them annually. Bert Underwood's 1943 obituary noted he made his name synonymous with news photography in its early days in the United States, Europe, and Asia. There are two side notes of interest on the Underwood house. First, it is believed that when the Pennington family owned this home in the 1930s, They were visited by Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, wife of the 28th president. And a 1968 real estate listing included the detail that the home had an electric elevator that ran from its basement to its second floor. The last home on today's tour is 93 Prospect, originally owned by Harry Gifford and his family and designed by his brother Charles, who had also drawn the plans for 72 Prospect. Charles, the architect, and his wife Helen lived in a home they called Avebury at 14 Bedford Road, later the priest residence on the campus of Oratory Prep, and now raised in the site of the school's gym and administrative headquarters. A newspaper article from 1906 noted this home at 93 Prospect was constructed of rough brick in the severe colonial style prevalent in this country in Revolutionary times. It had 7 bedrooms and 2 baths. The stairs had mahogany handrails, and the doors were constructed of both mahogany and birch. Presumably, Henry Gifford selected his architect due to them being brothers, but over the years, Charles made a name for himself well beyond Summit's borders. He designed structures that include the Jekyll Island Club in Georgia, the original clubhouse for the Short Hills Racquet Club, New Hampshire's Mount Washington Hotel, and the New Jersey buildings at both the 1893 and 1904 World's Fairs. Thank you. If today's presentation has sparked your interest in learning more about the history of Summit, or maybe that of your home or your family or your street or your school, please remember that all of the materials in the archives of the Carter House are available to everyone at no charge. We also hope you'll consider making a donation to support our all-volunteer efforts, or maybe you'll consider joining us as a member or as a volunteer. We are staffed by docents on Tuesday mornings, Wednesday afternoons, and by appointment, and we really do hope you'll visit. I am happy to try and answer questions if anyone has them. We could also take your questions, and if we don't know the answer, look it up for you and get back to you. Because every once in a while, someone will say, oh, I want to come down to the Carter House and look at this. We have a wall of 15 7-drawer file cabinets. Everyone is packed to the gills. So we really do have a lot of different information, and all of it is available to all of you. Does anyone have questions? Dad? Yes, that was Judy's and Joey's house, if that's what you were going to ask. My father's cousin and her first husband were the ones who converted what's now 54 Oakland from a carriage house to a house. And did a beautiful job.
Before they refurbished it. All the homes that were shown today, how many are still standing?
Of the homes that I showed today, and keep in mind that Summit is losing about 1 home a month to demolition. Of the homes that I showed today, all but 3 or 4 of them are still standing.
One home a day.
1 home a month. Summit's losing about a home a month. We lose about 12 houses a year. And some of them are old and significant homes.
Any particular neighborhood?
No, the homes that are coming down in Summit now are coming down all over, yes.
Maybe designated historic and not be raised.
No, even buildings on the National Register can be demolished.
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned a Bennett family.
Yes, the Bennett
Are they
family.
related to former Mayor Jim Bennett?
I don't know. The question is, are the Bennett family that was mentioned, are they related to former Mayor Jim Bennett in Summit? And I don't know the answer to that. Yes.
You mentioned earlier in the presentation, the Stanley Steamer Park,
Mm-hmm.
Stanley Avenue in Summit, and Stanley Park.
Oh, yes. For the people watching on Zoom at home, someone just reminded me that Stanley Steamer, Stanley Avenue, is it Stanley Avenue? I think I called it Stanley Road. It is Stanley Avenue. in Summit and Stanley Park, which is technically in Chatham, are both named for that. And it's
It's split by the river.
by the river, right? Yes. And if you haven't been down Stanley, it's worth it because it's never been paved, ever. So it's just very interesting to see that and there's at least one house, maybe more than one down there, that are owned by Union County. And there's a house down there that used to have horses out in a paddock. I think they still might. So it kind of gives you an idea of sort of Summit in its old days.
That's Old Stanley Park.
Stanley Park, on the Chatham side, it is paid for and maintained by, I believe, the Kiwanis in Chatham. And on the Summit side, I believe it's Union County. And if you haven't been down there lately, the Passaic River is running really high. And it's kind of interesting to see because we've had such a wet spring. So like during a dry summer, it's hard to see how there would have once been mills using the Passaic River for their energy. But if you go right about now, the river's running really high and you can get an idea of the power of that water. And on a nice day, it's a great day to have a picnic. There are tables on both sides and there's a ton of parking. And it's always interesting. Yes, and there's a barbecue for cookouts. There are very often people on their lunch hour up on the bridge fishing, which is just always interesting to see because you don't think of fishing in Summit. Anybody else? If not, thank you very, very much. And I really do hope you'll all come visit the Carter House. Thank you.